Right, where is my PowerPoint? Okay. Well, to begin with, thank you for inviting me here, Annette. And it's quite an honor. I have to say, yesterday when we had dinner with a small group of people, we were reminiscing, of course, as you do at these occasions. And Peter and I were thinking about 20 years back when I was still somewhat of a young scholar. And I was at a seminar in Dubrovnik, very small seminar, with people that I considered the big names in communication studies at that time. So it was Peter, someone Colin Sparks, a couple of all the other English guys, and I was very nervous because I wasn't where I am now. And I must say some of these nerves come back today, because obviously at occasions like this, your old heroes remain your old heroes, and you never know whether you can live up to what they would expect of you now. But I'm going to try. On a day like today, and we're going to have a lot of this, it seems appropriate. Sorry, that's the wrong one. Where did it go? Hey. Interesting. This is what happened at breakfast, right? That's what I did. Okay, on a day like, there should be a slide here, but I can read to you. On a day like today, it's appropriate to start with a quote. It's appropriate to start with two quotes by quotes from Peter's newest book. And it's about knowledge in civic cultures. And on page 109 of his book, Peter says, "What kinds of knowledge are required for the vitality of heterogeneous civic cultures that can never be established once and for all, but must always be open for discussion?" So that's one thing. The other quote on a page later is, "We must be alert to the question of the efficacies of different modalities of knowledge for civic agency in situations of power relations." And these are Peter's words. So what he says is, he says we need knowledge for vital and diverse civic cultures, but we don't know exactly what kind of knowledge we need. And in addition, finding out or even identifying what that knowledge should be will be articulated in and with power relations. Now, my first claim for today is that we are faced with somewhat of a knowledge crisis. All the institutions that used to have a grip on knowledge and could be trusted to provide us with knowledge and even truth are currently under fire. And we see that governments across the world are witness to continuously and systematically declining levels of trust. For instance, in the United States, around 1960, 70% of the people trusted the government, whereas now that's only 25% of the people. And we have similar tendencies of declining trust in government across the Western world. Media, and in particular the news media, are now more often seen as a source of bias than as a source of information, truth, and knowledge. And again, there are easy examples from the US with some ultra-biased news channels like Fox, but it's also clear in the United Kingdom, for instance, when you look at the tabloids and the broadsheet papers. And according to my colleagues in England, it's there more so than ever. Now, in education, one of these other respected institutions of knowledge, we see that the curricula are continuously under struggle. And I could again give examples from the US. I'll give you an example from my own situation. My son is at a gymnasium in Amsterdam. He has a biology teacher who is, in fact, a creationist. And although the school says you can't teach this, he doesn't find it a problem to sometimes mark on papers that, okay, this is evolution theory, but what would you think if we would look at it from the perspective of God's design? Open question, but very interesting contestation of knowledge as we know it. Science then. Certainly we should be able to trust science. We should be able to believe scientific knowledge. But the same story can be told, especially in areas like the environment and health. Both are sectors where research outcomes are contested, manipulated, exaggerated and downplayed to serve particular interests. And again, in England, there's a famous scandal called ClimateGate with scholars of the University of East Anglia manipulating their figures to serve the particular climate agenda. The obvious example here is the pharmaceutical industry that is famous for manipulating research outcomes about health and medicine. The last one, history. We should be able to agree on what has happened in the past, right? But of course we are not. And this is also an area of contestation of what really happened, ranging from Holocaust denial, Armenian genocide denial, and what have you, to simply contesting a historical canon. So, to exaggerate, not much, but just a little bit, we have what I would call a full-blown crisis about what is knowledge, what counts as true, and whom can we trust to know things. And that crisis is also visible in a number of recent and unexpected cases in which the official institutions lost control. For instance, in 2009, the Dutch government introduced a national campaign for the vaccination of girls between 12 and 13 years old against cervical cancer. And that campaign failed after an outburst of internet discussions about the pros and cons of such vaccination. The voices of ordinary mothers on the internet, gained more credit than those of the medical authorities, and as a result, that campaign failed. In the UK, around 2006, the introduction of a national identity card was considerably delayed due to unexpected public resistance, and the card scheme never recovered. It has now been abolished by the current government, and identity cards have ceased to be legal documents from January this year. Currently, as you probably know, the population of Stuttgart keeps protesting massively against building a new train station, Stuttgart 21. And this unexpectedly persistent and persistent protest led to a change of government after the recent state elections in Germany. And the Greens are now in power, and the building of the station has been put on hold. Now, these examples have two things in common. First is that the respective authorities did not expect them at all. And second, these same authorities have framed the failure of their policies as the consequence of public irrationality and distrust, both rapidly and uncritically multiplied through the internet. And they said, for instance, that the vaccination failure was caused by what they called tall stories, Indian stories on the internet. And of course, the winners in these controversies saw an inspiring expression of critical thinking and framed the outcome as a legitimate victory for the right point of view, a sign of an empowered public. Now, it's not my intention to discuss these contending claims in themselves. Rather, I want to propose to see them as expressions of our knowledge crisis, and I also want to interrogate them as articulation of the current zeitgeist, a word that unites all Europeans and Anglos in the same way. Now, what is this zeitgeist? Very briefly, modernity and risk society are, of course, concepts that hardly need explaining, and especially not in this company. Summarized in one sentence, these terms cover the idea that social and technological progress have made it possible to bring much of society's earlier problems under control, but progress itself has now created risks that we can control much less, or not at all. And Ulrich Beck and Anthony Giddens are the authors that we associate with these theories. And we can think of the environment, new diseases like SARS or the swine flu, natural disasters like earthquakes and tsunamis, human disasters, global poverty, terrorism, the banking crisis. These are all the risks that are very often mentioned. And the British sociologist Frank Furedi, he has added that where there is risk, there's fear. He claims that fear has become the dominant state of mind and has become a political problem in itself. Crime policy, for instance, he argues, is as much about containing people's fears as it is about fighting crime itself. So there you have it. despite our prolonged life expectancy and our various luxuries, we, you and I, we are continuously aware that something bad might happen. I guess here it would be the snow, in Japan it would be the earthquake. We don't know who is to blame, because many of these problems are tied up in unclear global corporate networks. We don't know who to turn to for protection, because our governments are obviously not in control. For instance, not in control of the banks. We don't even know whether all these risks are true, because academics don't agree on the causes of global warming. And the expected global swine flu pandemics never took place. So what do we do in such a situation of high insecurity, of not knowing the truth, or not knowing who to trust? We do two things. First, we blame, of course, the other. And in the current zeitgeist, we blame the left, we blame the Muslims, we always blame Jews, there's nothing new there. And secondly, we look for causes, we look for simple causes. Big corporations, for instance, wasn't a strong argument against the cervical cancer vaccinations that it only served the interest of big pharma, of the big pharmaceutical industries, and isn't a strong argument against Stuttgart 21 that it is an overly ambitious local government doing that. Expanding ambitions need to be curtailed. So we blame the other, and there's a lot of blaming around at the moment. And if we would pursue this line of argument, it would bring us into the dark but exciting corners of conspiracy theory, which is a fascinating topic, and which I will therefore leave for another time. What I do want to explore is the second option to resolve our insecurities. We recur to ourselves. When the truth is hard to find, when we no longer trust that established institutions hold these truths and can deliver solutions, there seems to be no other beacon left than the self, and especially what one can witness oneself, the direct experience, what one can feel. I see, therefore I know. I've seen it myself, so it must be true. I feel it like that. You are entitled to your opinion, but this is how I feel, so deal with it. That kind of self-centered reasoning. How does that work exactly? The recurrence to the self. To begin with, I'm of course not the only one to observe this phenomenon. There's quite a buzz around it. Stephen Colbert, an American TV network journalist, for instance, he introduced the word truthiness in 2005. And with that word, he criticized the increasing tendency of American media to report from an ideological point of view at the expense of factual knowledge. As long as it feels true, it must be true. And as it says on the quote, truthiness is the quality of preferring concepts or facts one wishes to be true rather than concepts or facts known to be true. Some recent books have discussed this in more detail. Communication in the Age of Suspicion collects different chapters about the waning trust in media information. A fantastic book by Farhad Manjoo called The Post-Fact Society, about facts as a matter of personal preference. Then there's a renewed interest in narcissism, and this builds, of course, on the work of Christopher Lasch. But it also introduces the possibility of narcissism in civic affairs, in public affairs. And the English-Greek new media researcher Zizi Papakarici has coined the term civic narcissism in this context. So how does this civic narcissism work? Where do we find this post-fact society? And how do we recognize truthiness? It's probably the easiest to use an example again from research we did a couple of years ago about Dr. Phil. I hope you're all familiar with Dr. Phil. Nod if you are. Yeah? Yes. Good. No explanation here needed there. But it's not any Dr. Phil show. Around 2004, with the presidential elections then between Kerry and Bush, Dr. Phil invited the two candidates to his show to talk about their family